Anwen felt the change almost as soon as the mountain seals dissolved.
Let's go,
she urged as they emerged from the great crystal. She headed towards the low opening she'd seen Kern use what felt oh so long ago. Tyler wasn't far behind. The two emerged from behind the mountain in a burst of color. Having taken a separate tunnel, they'd managed to sweep in behind the Revenant army. As one, the two cried out in defiance. Silver flames lit up the sky as they dived towards the gates where Courtney and now Walter stood. Revenants swarmed towards the now open gates as if called there. Tyler dived, coming up just short of colliding with the stone as he flew like a missile towards those heading up the path leading to their friends. The Revenants scattered like bowling pins before the oncoming ball. Anwen followed up with breaking claws that gouged the eyes of any enemy. Their attention switched from the now open maw leading into the mountain to focus on the attack. She let loose another bout of flame as she flapped back to a higher altitude. Courtney stared up in shock at the sound of the two dragons. She recognized Tyler right off. She had no idea where the silver-like purple dragon had come from. The mage felt sure she didn't know any with that particular color. And then Walter was charging down the path, his gun pulled up from hanging across his back. He sprayed bullets in continuous fire. It took Courtney a moment to realize he'd changed guns. He now used an automatic instead of the other she'd seen him using earlier. Strength returned at the sight of her friend back in the sky. The keeper charged down the path. Courtney held the crystal sword high as she ran to the battle. The blade seemed to freeze anything it touched as she swung left and right at whatever might cross her path. Anwen landed in front of the open gates, blocking them from any who might approach. She fanned her wings, thrilling at the sense of flying. It amazed her that her fear of heights seemed to have disappeared with her mortal body. Those dragons still in the thick of the battle raised at the rallying cry Tyler let loose from his throat. They fought with more ferocity after that. As a result, the mages also took strength as they pressed against their foes. Soon the cries of wounded revenants filled the air. They were louder than any cries the dragons had made earlier. Leslie made her way through the ruined city, running into Walter as his gun ran out of ammunition. Her eyes seemed to light up at the sight of him. Despite that, she refrained from following her desire from throwing herself at him.
You're alive.
She breathed instead.
Of course. Still fighting, too.
Walter quipped, pulled out some handguns and shot a few revenants trying to sneak out behind the wall.
A lot of strange things was happening today.
The thought niggled at the back of his mind that he was forgetting something, but he shook it off. The battle called and he was more than ready to answer it. The dragons swept through the sky, picking off enemies from their higher vantage. Some still carried mages on their backs. Most looked more than a little worse for wear, but they were managing. Leslie lost no time in helping take out the lesser revenants around them. While she did that, Walter ran to the nearest cache of goodies. She caught sight of him out of the corner of her eye as he lobbed a grenade into the air. In one fluid motion, she whacked the flying canister towards the nearest target seconds before it exploded. Dark matter flew up into the air like a volcano had erupted, spewing out obsidian stone. The chunks hit into everything in their way, taking out more demons, along with a few mages. Smoke filled the area once more, along with the cries of the fighting throngs, and then everything went silent. The dark mists seemed to settle, revealing the standing survivors. None of them were revenants. Faces turned to and fro as if they couldn't quite believe the fighting was over. Leslie felt her muscles tense. Walter picked up on it as well.
What's wrong?
He asked. Not sure he understood why, but trusting his instincts. Then the ground shuddered violently. Several mages fell to their knees from the strain of the battle, and then the earth shuddered again and again in a rhythm that could only mean one thing. Something quite large was approaching. Darkness filled the sky once more as a shadow fell across the mountain that had nothing to do with clouds. One revenant stood defiant, towering over the masses. Its sheer size made the majority of the dragons seem small in comparison. It almost dwarfed the largest dragon still standing. The silence changed in quality as the figure stopped to look around. It smiled a cruel smile, knowing the majority of those around him were spent.
At last!
It hissed through rotted teeth. its face split in a cruel line tinged in red. Many knees quaked at the sight of the beast. Its shadow appeared to engulf the whole mountain in darkness. The jagged edges looked able to cut through matter just from its presence. Several hearts faltered as weapons fell to the ground with dull thuds. Some mages even went so far as to cover their heads with their hands as they reverted to a fetal position. Brilliant light suddenly burst into being from the peak of the mountain. Kern standing in the midst of it.
Not yet,
he defied, his wings raised high above his sinuous neck. The white scales flashed in the light surrounding him, but they seemed just a hint duller than usual. The Revenant King laughed.
You are old, Nurrim.
He said with the sound of grinding boulders.
You are weak, and your weakness will be your undoing.
But the white dragon shook his head.
So, I may be old and will soon rejoin the eternal stream. But not yet, Dorchadas. Not yet.
His eyes remained hard as he stared out at the giant before him. Despite the difference in size, Kern somehow seemed more powerful. A snarl filled the air as the behemoth swiped into the air.
Words! Now stand aside that I may destroy. Decide that I may destroy. Sending our creators back to whence they came.
Kern seemed to straighten where he stood.
No.
His tail thumped the side of the mountain, sending down a smattering of rock with force. Tyler swooped down to join his leader on a ledge.
You will not pass,
he declared, eyes as hard as his sire's.
Then you shall both die.
The Revenant King called out as he took a step forward. Blue light shot out from Courtney's location as she sliced the air with a crystal sword.
Over our dead bodies!
She cried out as she rushed the Revenant. Without thinking, Leslie and Walter also charged the creature. Bugles filled the air as those dragons not too hurt rallied. They raked talons across the laughing mass of obsidian stone. The creature swept several aside as if they were nothing more than flies. Leslie adjusted her grip on her dual blades as she ran, using her momentum to slice up the creature's leg. Her blades scored shallow cuts along the way before she had to reverse her course. She tried to deepen the wounds as she came back down. Tyler launched himself from the peak at the same time Kern did. The two dragons swooped towards the Revenant King's head, trying to gouge out the glowing eyes. Both had to evade claws aimed to knock them from the sky. Anwen used her talons to scale halfway up the cliff face before turning to dive away from the surface. Shrieking like a banshee, she folded her wings at the last possible moment. Her talons sliced across the creature's midsection, hints of a deep red showing through the dark hide. Excited, more dragons tried to do the same. Some were swept from the sky by massive limbs. Others managed to swoop below the attack and add their own scores to the dark tome. The Revenant cried out in pain as one or two actually broke all the way through to the flesh underneath. Kern dived in, wings flashing as his claws raked down the side of the thing's face. He narrowly avoided being knocked from the sky by flying out of the way at the last second. Even with that near escape, Anwen could tell he was winded as she went in to offer support. Mages from the ground sent up chunks of rock formed into spears, hoping to break through the Revenant's defenses. More dragons swarmed around, trying to distract the monstrosity. Leslie uttered a spell to freeze the limb closest to her. She succeeded in creating an open wound near a massive joint, but it wasn't enough to slow the Revenant down. Instead, she got knocked to one side. The wind released from her lungs in a painful whoosh of cracked ribs. Walter ran to her side, checking to make sure she was okay. Relieved to find her still alive, he followed her, urging to get back into the fray. He quickly learned bullets were no use against this enemy and discarded his pistols. Instead, he looked for any hidden caches of weapons that hadn't been spoiled by the battle. Anwen took the opportunity to find another perch on the mountain. Slashing at the Revenant with claws could only do so much. She landed on the stone shelf Kira had used to form the spear meant to shear her mother's soul from her body. As her clawed feet hit the ground, she transformed into the more familiar mortal form she was used to. She didn't even have to think about doing it, though the back part of her mind wondered at this. She closed her eyes and saw the battle behind her eyelids. The others were all giving a valiant effort, but it wasn't quite enough. As she opened her eyes, however, she saw things in a different light. It was almost as though her vision cleared of all obstructions. She found she could see down to the smallest particle, past the atomic level. There was something different about two of her friends, Walter and Courtney. A new energy seemed to surge through them. She almost immediately understood what it meant, and a plan formed in her mind. There was only one problem. She needed help, and not in a way just anyone could give. Almost as if he'd heard someone calling him, Kern raced back towards the mountain. He landed lightly behind his many times great-granddaughter. The dying Dragon Lord transformed into the visage of an old man in a white robe as he landed. Once he reached Anwen's side, he saw the tears glistening in her eyes and nodded.
There is no other way,
He confirmed, hearing the contents of her thoughts. She threw her arms around his neck. He was just as much a father to her as her own had been.
I promise. I'll make a pretty difference.
She said in his ear. Kern gave her shaking shoulders a squeeze before he gently pulled away.
I know you will, my fair little dragon.
He gazed fondly into her eyes before turning to look out below. Anwen turned to follow his gaze. She swallowed hard, then reached out one by one to Walter, Courtney, Tyler, and Leslie's minds. She cut off all emotion as she mentally told them what she had in mind. Walter froze as the words Anwen sent him poured through not only his mind, but his soul. His eyes widened at what she was suggesting. He didn't have the same bond with all around him that she had. Despite that, he couldn't help but feel stricken at her suggestion. He was so shocked he didn't even contemplate how she was able to communicate with him. He turned to look towards Leslie, realizing she had the same frozen expression on her face that he did. Perhaps it was even more so since she seemed to understand the implications more than he did. But he noted her swallowing hard as she brought her thoughts back to order. Her eyes went hard in determination, and he took that for confirmation that this was the only way. With his sentiments confirmed, Walter moved to help Leslie to her feet, brushing off the dirt. He waited for her to nod briefly in acknowledgement of her readiness. Once he had it, he carefully paced a dozen steps away, turning to face the back part of their enemy. He noticed Leslie turning to face the same, only offset from his location by a dozen more steps. Courtney gasped as Anwen's plan formed in her mind. The shock she barely saw register on Walter and Leslie's faces formed on her own. How could Anwen even suggest such a thing? And how on earth did she know about it to begin with? She had to swallow the bile in her throat. They'd already lost too many friends this season. She didn't want to lose any more. But she couldn't deny that everything seemed to have led to this point. It all made sense. And yet she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss greater than any she'd felt so far as she realized what it would mean. It took her a moment to come to terms with the idea. Courtney knew they had to do something before all was lost. She didn't want to disrupt what she knew to be necessary. With that in mind, she positioned herself as requested, off to one side of the Revenant King. Tyler almost faltered in the sky as he heard Anwen's plan, but knew it was the correct course to take. The charge the spirit of the mountain had given them hung heavily on his shoulders. He knew what they had to do. The Dragon Lord found a place to land on the far side of the Revenant, facing him almost from the front. His position allowed him sight of both Walter and Courtney off to one side. He couldn't see Leslie due to the creature between them. More or less satisfied with their placement, he turned his head to the other side to see Anwen on the ledge as he nodded their readiness. Kern ran towards the edge. As he did, he returned to dragon form once more as he rejoined those harrying their foe. He wheeled up towards the massive head, making a pass or two at it before gaining some distance. At his cue, the other dragons attacked with a friendly On her ledge, Anwen spread her arms as wide as she could, eyes closed.
We call upon the spirit of the mountain,
She intoned. She could feel those she'd chosen mirroring her actions as closely as possible.
Let us join as one.
She felt the minds of her four friends as they synced together. Energy shot up from between the feet of each of the chosen fighters. Courtney's shot up with green intensity, Leslie's with orange. Tyler's energy shot out blue, while Anwen's was a mix of purple and silver. And then Walter's joined in, looking like the deepest red of fire. Anwen could feel the surprise and awe the man felt as their minds joined as one. More energy shot out from their hands. It merged with the others around them to create a pentagram shape around the Revenant. Her energy shot from hand to hand, so they all could take part of it. It reminded both Courtney and Walter of Tyler's astral projection of Anwen's soul. While they formed the pentagram of light around Dorchadas, the other mages and dragons continued to harry him from above and below. They were careful not to cross through the lines of energy for fear of what might happen. Their actions kept the Revenant King too distracted to notice anything else going on around him. As one, the five friends opened their mouths to speak.
That which was created in error, let it be undone, and sent back to whence it came.
Their arms rose as one, palms to the sky. Kern took that as his cue. He gave a few more beats of his mighty wings to achieve a greater distance between him and their enemy as the other dragons moved out of range. Then he came hurtling towards Dorchadas like a streak of lightning. The air burned with the speed of his passage. As he came closer, the Nurrim streamlined his body into a spear shape. The light from the others converged with him as he ran into the heart of the Revenant King. The creature reared at the impact, clawed and joints writhing to try and ward off the attack, but too late. Dragons flew back as if thrown, along with Courtney, Leslie, and Walter. Something close to a sonic boom filled the air as light engulfed the area where the Revenant King stood. The light was so bright it defied description, causing many to fall to the ground from the intensity of it. Finally, the light faded. Both dragons and mages alike slowly moved from their respective locations. Many groaned as joints ground in sockets. Dazed, they staggered to their feet and looked around. There was nothing left of the Revenant King except for a darkened spot on the rocks, as if from an